Before I get into these stories, I want to say something. I've covered a lot of territory on this channel. Abandoned buildings, remote cabins, dark forests at 3 in the morning. But every now and then, a batch of stories lands in my inbox that makes me genuinely stop and sit with them for a while before I decide to cover them. These 3 stories did that. All 3 of them come from the same region of Wisconsin, the Northwoods, and all 3 of them involve hunting camps, deep timber, and something that the locals up there have had a name for since the 1800s. The Hodag. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I never do. But I will tell you this. By the time you finish listening to all 3 of these accounts, you're going to have a hard time explaining them away. I know I did. This happened about 6 years ago, maybe 7. I was 31 at the time, and deer season in northern Wisconsin was basically a religion in my family. Every November, without fail, my Uncle Ray, my cousin Brody, and I would pack up the truck and drive up to a hunting camp we'd been leasing for years near Rhinelander, right in Oneida County. If you know anything about that part of Wisconsin, you know it's serious timber country. Dense canopy, hard logging history, creeks cutting through the terrain every quarter mile or so. It's not the kind of forest you casually wander around in. It's the kind of place where you go in knowing exactly where you're going. Because if you don't, you're going to have a very bad time. Brody and I had been going up there since we were kids. Uncle Ray had been going since the 1980s. So for all of us, this was comfortable ground, known territory. And I think that's part of what made what happened so disorienting. Because it didn't happen somewhere unfamiliar. It happened somewhere we thought we knew. The first 2 days of the trip were exactly what they always were. Cold, quiet, and good. We'd gotten up at 4:30 both mornings, hiked out to our stands in the dark, and settled in before first light. The forest up there in November is a different world. Everything smells like frozen earth and pine sap, and the only sounds are the ones that belong there. It sounds peaceful, and it is, but it's also the kind of silence that makes you very aware of when something breaks it. On the afternoon of the second day, Uncle Ray decided to take a solo walk down the eastern ridge toward Bear Trap Creek to check a trail camera he'd set up earlier in the season. Brody and I stayed back at the camp and started getting dinner going. Ray didn't come back until almost dark. When he walked through the door, I knew immediately something was off. Ray was not a man who spooked easily. Decades of hunting alone in these woods had made him about as unflappable as a person can get. But he sat down at the camp table without saying anything for almost a full minute. And that alone told me everything. When he finally talked, he said he'd found something near the creek. A camp, not ours, someone else's. Now, that wasn't necessarily unusual in itself. The logging roads back there were technically accessible to the public, and other hunters occasionally set up in the same general area. What bothered Ray wasn't the camp itself. It was what he found inside the camp shelter. The next morning, all 3 of us hiked out there together. It was a canvas wall tent, the old military surplus style. It had been set up maybe 200 yards off the main creek bed, half hidden by a cluster of balsam firs. From a distance, it just looked like a hunter's camp. A fire ring outside, a camp stove, a folding table with some gear on it. But the closer we got, the less right it felt. The fire ring had been used recently, not recently as in this season, but recently as in maybe the night before. There were fresh ash and partially burned logs inside it that were still slightly warm when Ray held his hand above them. The folding table outside had a propane lantern, 2 tin cups, and a large hunting knife stuck vertically into the wood of the table. Not set down, stuck in, like someone had driven it in deliberately. We pushed open the tent flap and looked inside. There were 2 sleeping bags laid out on cots, personal gear, a duffel bag, a cooler. Whoever had set this camp up had been living in it for days, at minimum. None of that was the problem. What stopped all 3 of us cold was what was on the inside of the tent wall, the back wall, opposite the entrance. Drawings, dozens of them, done in what looked like charcoal or ash, directly onto the canvas. They were crude, rough, frantic lines, but after a second of looking at them, you could make out what they were. Animals, mostly deer, some elk or moose shapes, and mixed in among them, repeating over and over, was a shape that none of us could immediately identify. It had 4 legs, a wide, low body, a long neck, and a back that was drawn with a distinct row of spikes or ridges running down the spine. Uncle Ray looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then quietly, he said, "That's a hodag." I had heard the word before. I knew the local folklore, the horned, spike-backed beast from Rhinelander. Most people in Wisconsin grow up hearing about it as a regional novelty, a tall tale, a piece of Northwoods mythology used to sell t-shirts at roadside shops. I had never once considered it as something to take seriously. Standing in that tent, looking at those drawings, I still wasn't sure I should take it seriously. But something else was bothering me a lot more than the drawings. The sleeping bags were both unzipped and laid flat, like 2 people had gotten out of them in a hurry. Not in the morning, in a hurry. One of the cots had been knocked sideways, and the duffel bag near the back wall had been partially upended, with clothes spilling out of it onto the tent floor. Whoever had been sleeping in this camp had left suddenly, and they hadn't come back. I'm going to be honest with you. There was a part of me that wanted to search around the area. Brody wanted to also. Uncle Ray overruled both of us. He said, and I remember this clearly, "Whatever happened here is none of our business, and whoever did it might still be close." We reported it to the Oneida County Sheriff's Office when we got back to town that afternoon. I don't know what they found, if anything. We never heard back. We didn't go back to that part of the creek for the rest of the trip. I still think about the knife in the table. Not the drawings. Not the overturned cot. The knife driven straight down into the wood, like a message or a warning, and the fire ring that had been warm the morning after 2 people apparently vanished from their camp in the night. To this day, I have no idea who was staying in that tent or what happened to them. I've tried to come up with explanations. I can't find one that satisfies me. And every November when we drive back up to Rhinelander, I find myself looking east toward Bear Trap Creek, and I make very sure I don't walk that direction alone. I'm a 28-year-old woman from Milwaukee, and before you say anything, yes, I hunt. Have since I was 16. My dad started taking me out when I was old enough to carry a rifle, and it stuck. I'm not the most experienced backcountry hunter in the world, but I know what I'm doing and I take it seriously. This happened 3 years ago in October. My dad and I, along with 2 of his longtime hunting buddies, both named Mike, which was always a logistical nightmare, rented out a private hunting camp in Forest County. That's in the deep Northwoods, southeast of Crandon. Heavily forested, very remote, and very close to the Nicolet National Forest boundary. The camp itself was a 2-room cabin, old but solid, with a porch that looked out over a narrow Tamarack bog about 80 yards from the front steps. It was beautiful in the way that remote Wisconsin in October always is. Burnt orange and red leaves, gray skies, the smell of wet wood everywhere. The first night, we all stayed up too late talking around the wood stove and didn't get out to our stands nearly early enough the next morning. No one minded. That's the point of hunting camp. The hunting is secondary to everything else. The second day was more productive. I sat in a stand my dad had set up near a scrape line on the north edge of the property and watched deer move through for most of the morning. It was the kind of day that reminds you exactly why you do this. That night, the second night, is when things started changing. We had all gone to bed around 10. I was in the back room with my sleeping bag on a cot. My dad and the two mics were in the front room. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. Late. 2 or 3 in the morning, probably. I woke up the way you sometimes do in an unfamiliar place, completely, instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. No gradual drift back to consciousness. Just awake. I lay there for a moment and tried to figure out what had woken me. The cabin was quiet. I could hear the two mics snoring faintly through the wall. And then I noticed the light. It was coming through the small window above my cot. A faint, greenish-white glow that pulsed slowly, not like a flashlight, not like a lantern, more like something phosphorescent and low to the ground. I climbed up on my knees to look through the glass. Out across the bog, maybe 150 yards into the Tamarack trees, there was a light moving slowly through the timber. It was low, maybe 3 or 4 feet off the ground, and it wasn't swinging or bobbing. It was moving in a perfectly steady, horizontal drift, left to right, slow, even, patient. I watched it for almost 2 full minutes before. I went and got my dad. To his credit, my dad took it seriously. He and one of the mics came to look, and they both saw it immediately. The light was still out there, still moving at that same slow, steady pace. Mic number 1, the more skeptical one, said it was probably a hunter from a neighboring property using a headlamp to check a camera. My dad pointed out that it was 2 in the morning and the light was the wrong color for any headlamp he'd ever seen. We stood there watching it for another few minutes. And then it stopped. Just stopped. Held perfectly still in one position. And we stood there watching a stationary light pulse slowly in the middle of a Tamarack bog at 2 in the morning, and none of us said anything for a long time. What happened next is the part one have the hardest time explaining. One of the mics, the one who'd been quiet the whole time, suddenly said in a very flat voice, "It's closer." And he was right. I hadn't consciously registered it, but the light was closer than it had been when it stopped moving. Not dramatically, maybe 20 yards, but it had moved without any of us seeing it move. One moment it was at one distance. The next it was at another. My dad went and got his rifle. He didn't say anything. He just did it. We stood on that porch for another 20 minutes, watching that light, and then it simply wasn't there anymore. No fade, no movement, gone. We did not sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, my dad and one mic walked out to the area where the light had been. I stayed on the porch and watched through binoculars. They found a section of flattened ground in the bog grass, a roughly circular area, maybe 10 to 12 feet across, where the vegetation had been pressed completely flat, not broken, not scorched, not disturbed the way an animal would disturb it. Pressed down, uniformly, like something large and heavy had simply sat there for a long time and then left. My dad photographed it on his phone. He sent it to the DNR a week after we got home. They never responded. I've heard the local legend of the Hodag described in different ways. Some versions say it glows. Some versions say it moves without sound. I'm not saying that's what we saw. I'm saying I genuinely do not have a better explanation. And the flattened circle in that bog stays in my head whenever I'm in a tree stand at night and the woods get too quiet. I've been a solo hunter for most of my adult life. I'm 44 now, and I've been doing this since my late 20s. I hunt alone because I genuinely prefer it. There's a focus and a calm that comes from being in the woods by yourself that you simply can't replicate when other people are around. My wife understands it. My kids think I'm eccentric. They're probably right. I've hunted in Wisconsin, Michigan, Montana, and twice in Alberta. I know how to read a forest. I know the difference between the sounds that belong there and the sounds that don't. I tell you this not to sound impressive, but because I want you to understand that when I say something was wrong that night, I mean that I knew it was wrong immediately and with complete certainty. This happened in November, 2 years ago. I was at a primitive hunting camp in Langlade County, solo, no electricity, no cell service past the first 2 miles of the logging road. I'd been going to this specific spot for 4 years. I knew the land. I knew the deer patterns, the creek crossings, the ridge lines. I had a plywood and canvas spike camp set up near a ridge line about 3 miles off the nearest forest road. The first 2 days were productive. I'd taken a shot at a good buck on day 1. Missed, unfortunately, but I'd seen consistent movement, which told me the rut was starting to push. I was in good spirits. I had food, fire, and 3 more days planned. Everything was exactly as it should have been. On the 3rd night, I had my fire burned down to coals by about 9 and turned in early. I wanted to be up by 4 at the latest. I fell asleep without any issues and slept hard for a few hours. I woke up at what my watch told me was 12:47 a.m. I didn't know what woke me. The camp was quiet. The fire was out. The woods outside were silent in the way that November Northwoods are always silent, dense, and total. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened carefully, the way you do when something has pulled you up out of a deep sleep for no reason you can identify. And then I heard it. Something was moving around the perimeter of my camp. Slowly, not erratically, slowly and deliberately, like something pacing a border. I could hear the dead leaves compressing underfoot in a steady rhythm. 1. Pause. 2. Pause. 3. Whatever was out there was heavy. Significantly heavier than a deer. The footfall sound was deep, the kind of compression that comes from serious mass. I reached over and quietly found my rifle in the dark. I chambered around without making a sound and sat up. The footsteps circled the camp completely. I tracked them by sound through the full 360 degrees. And then they stopped on the north side of my tent. Just stopped. And nothing moved for almost 2 full minutes. I can tell you with complete honesty that those were 2 of the longest minutes of my life. And then something happened that I haven't been able to explain to a single person I've told this story to. There was a sound, low, resonant, and continuous, like a vibration more than a vocalization. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a bellow. It was something in between. A deep, rolling pressure of sound that I could feel in my sternum. And it didn't stop. It went on for what I measured on my watch as 47 seconds without pause, without variation, without breaking. I have heard black bears. I have been within 40 yards of a bull elk in rut. I have heard wolves in Alberta at close range. I have never in my life heard a sound like that come out of an animal. It didn't sound involuntary. It sounded intentional, like whatever was making that sound knew exactly what it was doing. I had my rifle aimed at the tent wall the entire time. When the sound finally tapered off, the forest went completely silent again. No footsteps retreating, no brush moving, nothing. Whatever had been standing on the north side of my camp was simply no longer making sound. I didn't sleep. I sat in that sleeping bag with my rifle across my lap until the sky started to lighten at around 6 a.m. The moment I had enough visibility to move safely, I unzipped the tent and stepped out with my rifle raised. Nothing was there, or so I thought. I checked the perimeter of my camp in the early gray light. On the north side, exactly where the sound had come from, the ground told a story I was not prepared for. The soil and leaf litter had been disturbed across a wide swath, maybe 15 feet. There were depressions in the earth. Not clean tracks, not paw prints or hoof prints. Depressions, wide, heavy, irregular, as if something enormous had stood there and shifted its weight back and forth repeatedly. The depth of the impressions told me this was not a small animal, not even close. And in the middle of those depressions, laid out in a neat row on top of the disturbed leaves, were 3 items. My fire striker, my orange hunting cap, and a folded piece of paper, a topo map I used for navigation that I had left inside my tent the night before. I stood there and stared at those items for a long time. I don't know how long. Long enough for the cold to start getting to me. Something had entered my tent while I was in it. While I was awake. While I was sitting there with a chambered rifle listening to it make sounds outside. It had come in, taken 3 items, and laid them out in a row on the ground like a display. And I had not heard a single thing. I've tried to explain that part to people. Most of them stop me there. They say, "You were tired, you were scared, you left those things outside and just don't remember." And I understand why they say that. If someone told me this story, I'd probably say the same thing. But I know what I know. I was awake. My rifle was in my hands. And those items were inside the tent when I went to sleep. I packed up my entire camp in 40 minutes. Everything. I didn't care about the deer. I didn't care about the remaining days. I just needed to be moving, and I needed to be moving toward the road. The 3-mile hike out was the worst hike of my life. Not because anything else happened. Nothing did. But because the entire way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being escorted out. Like something was behind me at a fixed distance, making sure I left. I didn't look back. I made a decision early in that hike that I was not going to look back, and I kept it. I reached my truck around 8 a.m., threw my gear in the bed, and drove. I've done a lot of reading since then about the Hodag specifically, about Langlade County, about the indigenous accounts from that region that predate the European logging era. What I found didn't exactly comfort me, but it did make me feel slightly less like I'd lost my mind. There are accounts going back more than a century of something in those forests that doesn't behave like any animal in the North American catalog. Something that people have heard more than seen. Something that seems to understand the concept of territory in a way that feels almost deliberate. I still hunt. I still go solo. But I haven't gone back to Langlade County. I don't think I will. The 3 items are still in my truck. I haven't moved them. I don't know why. Maybe I feel like I owe something to whatever left them there. Like keeping them is my end of an agreement I didn't know I was making. That probably sounds crazy. Most true things do. 3 stories. 3 different corners of Wisconsin's Northwoods. 3 different people who went into those forests for the most ordinary of reasons and came back changed. I've thought a lot about what connects them. The Hodag legend is almost always framed as a joke, a piece of Wisconsin kitsch, something for bumper stickers and dive bar neon signs. But the older accounts, the ones that predate the novelty of it, describe something with genuine consistency. A territorial creature, one that circles before it confronts, one that seems, in some accounts, almost more interested in observing than attacking. Make of that what you will. If you've had an experience in the Wisconsin Northwoods, a hunting camp, a night in the backcountry, something you've never been able to explain, I want to hear it. The link to submit is in the description. Thanks for being here.